Imagine a nation filled with hope, a developing country eager to rise from the shadows of colonization. This was the Philippines in the 1960s, a country with so much potential. In the middle of this hopeful atmosphere rose Ferdinand Marcos, a man of immense charisma who captivated the Filipino public. His promises of progress and modernization resonated with a people ready for change. But as history tells us, appearances can deceive. Ferdinand Marcos's meteoric rise to power signaled not prosperity, but the beginning of the Philippines' economic destruction. Alongside him stood Imelda Marcos, whose influence and extravagance would add a unique layer of tragedy to this grim tale. Together, they put on a facade of a strong, forward-looking leadership. Behind the scenes, however, they orchestrated one of the most corrupt regimes the world has ever seen. At first, Marcos seemed like the leader the Philippines needed. Under his administration, public works projects flourished, capturing the public's faith in his competence. But this veneer of success quickly unraveled when his true intentions came to light. Even as he built roads and bridges, he quietly laid the foundation for an empire of corruption. When Ferdinand declared martial law in 1972, it was presented to the public as necessary for national security. But in reality, it was a move to consolidate power, dismantle checks and balances, and create an environment where billions could be siphoned out of the country without scrutiny. Under the guise of national progress, Marcos established a network of cronies, powerful allies who were granted monopolies and financial benefits in exchange for their loyalty. One of the Marcos administration's most infamous legacies is its unprecedented borrowing. During his years in power, Ferdinand Marcos took advantage of foreign creditors eager to lend money to the Philippines, framing this as necessary to fund development programs. But most of these loans were funneled into personal accounts and corrupt ventures. When Marcos first assumed power, the Philippines' national debt stood at $2 billion. By the time he fled in 1986, the debt had skyrocketed to $28 billion, leaving future generations to toil under the weight of repayments. The interest alone on these loans bled national budgets dry, crippling social services and infrastructure development for decades to come. This debt frenzy was paired with disastrous policies that stagnated economic growth. Key industries became monopolized by Marcos's supporters, choking competition and innovation. His regime's focus was not economic sustainability, but self-enrichment, resulting in escalating unemployment and spiraling inflation. Beside Ferdinand, Marcos stood his wife Imelda, a figure whose name is synonymous with extravagance and greed. Imelda Marcos embodied the regime's excesses with her infamous accumulation of luxury goods. Who can forget the images of her 3,000 pairs of shoes stored in a closet larger than most Filipino homes? Her extravagant taste stretched beyond shoes. She spearheaded vanity projects like the Cultural Center of the Philippines and the Coconut Palace, structures built more to project a sense of elitist power than to serve any functional purpose. While these buildings stood tall as symbols of opulence, millions of Filipinos languished in poverty, unable to afford basic necessities like food and shelter. Her push for grandeur extended internationally. Imelda used public funds to finance lavish trips abroad, shopping sprees that lasted for weeks, and extravagant parties that cost millions of dollars. All this took place while the Philippines suffered one of the highest rates of poverty in Southeast Asia. The Marcos regime didn't merely rob the nation of its wealth, it robbed Filipinos of their dignity and future. As economic decline spiraled out of control, ordinary citizens paid the price. Inflation soared, causing basic goods to become unaffordable. Unemployment reached record highs as businesses that opposed the regime were stifled or shut down. Martial law worsened these struggles. Protest within the business community was silenced with arrests, asset freezes, or outright intimidation. Thousands of innocent people, students, journalists, activists, were tortured, imprisoned, or killed simply for questioning the government's policies. A dictatorship designed to curb dissent created a sense of fear that permeated every aspect of society, including the economy. Without room for criticism or reform, the Philippines sank further into despair. By the early 1980s, the cracks in the Marcos regime had begun to widen. The assassination of Benigno Ninoy Aquino Jr., a vocal critic of Marcos, served as the tipping point. Public outrage over Ninoy's death fueled mass protests as discontent with economic stagnation and political oppression reached boiling point. At the same time, the global economy began to play a role. International lenders grew increasingly frustrated with the economic mismanagement under Marcos. It became clear the regime was unsustainable. Finally, in 1986, Filipinos took to the streets in what is now known as the People Power Revolution. Millions marched peacefully, demanding the end of dictatorship. Overwhelmed, the Marcos family fled to Hawaii, leaving behind a country ravaged by their greed. The aftermath of the Marcos regime was grim. The national debt heaped upon the Philippines meant future governments had limited resources to support social welfare programs or infrastructure development. Poverty rates remained high, and corruption, deeply rooted during the Marcos years, continued to plague the country's political and economic systems. Efforts to recover the stolen billions have been ongoing for decades, with limited success. While some assets have been reclaimed, much of the Marcos family's ill-gotten wealth remains outside the reach of Philippine authorities, hidden in offshore accounts or expensive properties abroad. Meanwhile, the Marcos name has managed to stage a political comeback, a chilling reminder of how short public memory can sometimes be. The Marcos regime is a cautionary tale about how greed and unchecked power can destroy a nation. It serves as a stark reminder of the importance of democratic principles, transparency, accountability, and public participation. Economic prosperity cannot thrive in an environment where corruption is normalized, institutions are weakened, and dissent is suppressed. It also underscores the critical role of citizens in safeguarding democracy. The People Power Revolution illustrates the ability of a united people to challenge tyranny, but it's not an endpoint. It's a call to remain vigilant. Leaders must be held accountable, and history must not be forgotten, lest the mistakes of the past be repeated. The Marcos era left scars that stretch beyond the economy. It was a moral and social devastation that shook the core of the Philippines. The country is still paying for their greed, literally and figuratively. But by learning from this dark chapter, Filipinos can strive toward a brighter, more equitable future. The first step? Awareness. History, if forgotten, risks being rewritten. We invite you, the viewers, to reflect on this story and ask, what kind of society do we want to build? What traits should we demand from our leaders? These aren't just questions for Filipinos, they're questions for all of us. Because no matter where you live, the lessons of greed, power, and resistance are universal. Together, we can build something better.